The Lord be with you. A reading of the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. Jesus said to the chief priests and the elders of the people, "Hear another parable. There was a landowner who planted a vineyard, put a hedge around it, dug a wine press in it, and built a tower. Then he leased it to tenants and went on a journey. When vintage time drew near, he sent his servants to the tenants to obtain his produce. But the tenants seized the servants, and one they beat, another they killed, and the third they stoned. Again he sent other servants, more numerous than the first ones, but they treated them in the same way. Finally he sent his son to them, thinking, 'They will respect my son.' But when the tenants saw the son, they said to one another, 'This is the heir. Come, let us kill him and acquire his inheritance.' They seized him, threw him out of the vineyard, and killed him. What will the owner of the vineyard do to those tenants when he comes?" They answered him, "He will put those wretched men to a wretched death and lease his vineyard to other tenants who will give him the produce at the proper times." Jesus said to them, "Did you never read in the Scriptures, 'The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. By the Lord has this been done, and it is wonderful in your eyes?' Therefore, I say to you, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a people that will produce its fruit." The Gospel of the Lord. For the third Sunday in a row, we find ourselves being invited by Jesus to stand in the parable of a vineyard. A parable about the kingdom of God and about our task as the tenants, the workers of that vineyard. We may not ever have actually worked in a vineyard, and maybe our closest association with a vineyard has been through its produce. Perhaps contemplating the deep questions of life while we held a wonderful glass of, as a friend of mine would say, an amusing Merlot or a serious Cabernet. But we are confronted with these parables that are surely meant to engage us as they continue to reveal important teachings about our spiritual well-being. As Martin Luther once said when he was talking about parables, you have to squeeze a biblical passage until it leaks the gospel. Isn't that a great line? Squeeze the biblical passage until it leaks the gospel. In each of these parables that we have heard, there is an owner of the vineyard. In each parable, there are workers needed to make the vineyard fruitful according to the expectations of the owner. And in each parable, the behavior of the workers and the tenants becomes problematic. And in each of the parables, the conclusion provides a clear and even somewhat uncomfortable teaching by the storyteller, Jesus, who offers an insight into God's expectations and the responsibilities of those invited to come into the vineyard. So perhaps it's helpful to look at these parables with three things in mind. First, For us, the vineyard is not in Judea. The vineyard is the zip code where we live. Secondly, the relationship between the workers, the vines, and the harvest is the care that we take of what God has sown and what God expects by way of a harvest in the vineyards where we live. And the third lens is that the landowner who is presented in the image of God, the one who carefully prepares the vineyard for those invited to come into it, is, in the words from the prophet Isaiah, "What more was there to do for my vineyard that I have not done?" God is portrayed as the one who arranges everything for those who will take care of the inheritance that God would have them enjoy, shaping our lives and our world so that it will indeed be a fruitful and acceptable return, a harvest, a full harvest to God. And so the parable challenges us to ponder whether we are producing that good harvest in the vineyard that bears the addresses where we live. As St. Francis de Sales once said, "Don't sow your desires in someone else's garden. Cultivate your own as best you can. Don't long to be other than you are, but be fully what you are." And so in the midst of social ills and unrest and tragedies and large challenges all over the world, we are first disciples in our own neighborhoods. It is there that the first seeds of the kingdom are sown, and it's there that we begin to nurture the goodness that can be a harvest for the many. The reign of God will grow well beyond our efforts, but it must start with our efforts. The wild grapes of the vineyard in Isaiah and the misguided thinking of the workers in the parable seems to indicate that sometimes the vision of God doesn't unfold as God might have dreamed it would. And that's the hard lesson that's presented to the chief priests and the elders of the people. It could even give us pause as well. The one thing we have some control over is how we go about tending that mission in the vineyard that the Lord gives to us, how we consider the things that we learn from these parables, like compassion, justice, forgiveness, respect. Keeping in mind, of course, we don't own the vineyard. We are the workers within it. And then we also squeeze from the gospel a God imaged as the owner who trusts us. The parable says, and it's rather subtle, that the owner goes on a journey, a sign that the owner had complete trust in the tenants to do what the owner had in mind, good stewards. The judgment of the parable we can't avoid is harsh. And it is directed in the parable of today at the chief priests and the elders of the people for their arrogance and their failure to hear the words of Jesus and of the prophets before him. We may not see ourselves as members of the chief priests and the elders of the people, but in one way or another, we are in positions of leadership. We are in positions of mentoring, of modeling, of providing example to others. Teachers of life in so many different kinds of ways, having influences and opportunities to show the faithfulness of the tenant, of the worker in the vineyard. in our neighborhood, our places of work, within our families and our communities of faith. Perhaps we, even from time to time, take for granted that the gift and the grace of the harvest that we celebrate at Eucharist is simply all mine. It's what I ought to have. But the parable reminds us that we are accountable for what we do, with first the vineyard and then the harvest. God doesn't give up on us easily. As stewards and tenants, we are co-workers, not the idle onlookers of the other parable, nor the power brokers who sought to own it, but the grateful, faithful, joyful laborers. And as such, there's no fear we will ever be unemployed.